Greetings, students, and welcome to this lecture, which is essentially a review of our Unit 5. All right, I'm Dr. T. Let's get started. All right, so in this lecture, we will basically be going over the main ideas that we've covered so far in this unit. Unlike previous unit reviews, though, we're going to forgo the philosophical talk section. And we're kind of going to get straight to the ideas and work through them, help you remember what we've covered so far. Basically, because we've essentially covered a lot of the additional political philosophy talking points throughout this unit, kind of preparing you to put together your ideal state. Okay. That being said, let's hop right into it. So first, the key terminology. Okay, we've learned a lot of key terminology, but the terminology you should put emphasis on are the following, because they're essentially at the heart of our early modern thinkers, right? So the state of nature, social contract, totalitarian state, and a liberalism state. Okay. Now, the state of nature, essentially, if you remember, was the starting point, the imaginary starting point that each philosopher used, okay, of how they imagined people to be pre-government, okay? And they had different perspectives on this, which we'll go over, of course, in the next slide and review in a moment. The social contract, by definition, was the agreement between state and the people, right? And of course, there were different perspectives on this, but again, it sets the foundation for from the philosophers took it from the state of nature to creating a social contract based on how they viewed individuals within the state of nature. Okay, a totalitarian state is basically Hobbes' view, where a government system you can think of having total power over the people, over the state, and regulating everything. Whereas a liberalism state is one where things are liberal, where you think of freedom, right? And people have freedom to do as they choose. Now, we also covered ideas of natural rights, those things basically inherent to people that can't be taken away. And we briefly talked about Plato as far as setting the foundation for this idea of having a social contract or some kind of agreement with your state. But those are kind of background in relation to the key terms above that you'll need to know for the final exam. Okay. Now, I'm sorry. Let's move forward here. Okay, so moving forward, my apologies for that. So, the key thinkers in comparison that we covered so far, right? So, we've looked at Thomas Hobbes, right? And his essential idea was that we should give all the power to one governing source, okay? He believed that at the end of the day, due to human nature being egotistical and self interested, that the state of nature would essentially be a very rough and hard place to live. People would be unhappy, so unhappy that they'd be willing to sacrifice their power, their individual power, and give it up to the state or to one sovereign source in order to maintain peace and thus protect the one natural right that they had, according to Hobbes, which was their right to life. Okay. This was his idea in a super short summary without really digging into all the pieces. Locke was the other end of that extreme, right? Locke basically said that at the end of the day, he focused on liberty and freedom and limited government, and the government only protecting life, property, and freedoms. Okay, so this was his particular stance. And again, it was based on the view that people were typically rational. The state of nature would not be as harsh as Hobbes prescribed. So this was why he held his particular view. Okay. Finally, we covered Rousseau. Okay. Rousseau gave us a little bit different perspective. He thought that the state of nature, man was perfect. That was when they were essentially pure and at their best, and that it's actually society itself, this development of society, that corrupted the pure man. Okay. So therefore, his social contract was based on looking at this new version of man that developed and having them work as a collective, everybody giving their voice. So direct democracy was Rousseau's idea, right? Everyone giving their voice in order to create an ideal society that you're willing to submit to, but you're submitting to a society in which you've technically designed as a collective, okay, for the will of all right? And going back quickly, the final piece to Locke to keep in mind is one way he avoided the corruption that came with Hobbes' thought is by separating, creating separation within government, right? So a checks and balance system. So these are all the key ideas that you should make sure you know. If all of that sounded super familiar to you and you already had those points noted down as you're going through your notes, you're like, check, 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 then you're good to go, at least in relation to these ideas for the final exam and being prepared. All right. So, Rawls. We talked about Rawls as a contemporary thinker, right? And you should be familiar with his general ideas, okay? In his contemporary version of a social contract. Now, mainly the ideas from Rawls that you want to walk away with are the veil of ignorance, understanding what that is, which, if you recall, it was his version of a state of nature, of the state of nature in which you essentially erase all that you know about yourself. You're ignorant to your social status, age, race, etc. And his idea was that from this starting point versus Hobbes, Rousseau, or all the other states of nature, we create this kind of perfect situation in which neutrality is created, and people, most rational people, will set up an ideal society from this starting point, okay? And he believed that they would pick two principles, and you should be familiar with those principles. Of course, the equality principle, because they want to make sure they're taken care of in case they're the least well off in society. And then also the redistribution principle, okay? And that's the notion of, again, if equality is not met, setting up a system which looks out for the least well off, and just knowing that wheelchair ramps, affirmative action, these types of things, even if we think about testing, giving uh, um, different standards for testing. All of these things would, or more time if people have accommodations. That's the word I'm looking for. Accommodations for testing. All of these kind of things would fall under Rawls' idea of looking out for those who are the least well off in society. Okay, so if I were to give a question, for example, on the final of which of these social systems is a reflection of Rawls' theory of redistribution, and I gave affirmative action along with some other ideas, you would know and be able to understand that affirmative action is the correct choice. All right. Okay, so the next thing we talked about was civil disobedience, which again is a big topic within socio-political thought. And you should be able to, of course, first define what is civil disobedience, which is, hopefully it came right to mind for you, which is essentially disobeying or breaking a particular law while still maintaining the overall law. Okay, so you're not essentially throwing the, what do they say, the baby out with the bathwater, as the saying goes, right? You're not throwing all the laws out, but you're breaking a particular law, typically under the notion that that law itself is unjust. Okay. You should know that definition. You should also know the views of the early modern thinkers specifically. Hobbes would be against civil disobedience based off of his state of giving all the power to govern to one governance and not pushing back. He was against revolution. Locke, of course, would be for civil disobedience, or at least in alignment with civil disobedience, because he allowed for revolution within his theory. And then finally, Rousseau would essentially, because he was emphasizing the power of the people, would be okay with civil disobedience under the idea that basically it's the people bringing about the change they wish to see within their society, okay? And finally, though, in addition to knowing the early modern thinkers and their thoughts on civil disobedience, you should also be familiar with Plato's historical view, and then the contemporary thinkers of Thoreau and King. Plato aligned with who? With Hobbes, right? He was against civil disobedience because he felt it corrupts the entire system and breaks it down. Whereas Thoreau and King, Thoreau was mostly aligned with Locke with the emphasis on freedom and liberties. and was in accordance or in alliance with civil disobedience, and whereas King was in, essentially, you can align him with Rousseau because he was really focused on the people and for civil disobedience. Um, but his reasoning was a bit different, right? It was for the sake of the people and making the state itself better. But also, the difference between Thoreau and King is the use of violence. Thoreau said violence might be necessary. King was completely nonviolent, at least until later in his life. All right. Finally, what do we have next? So we've covered all the key points. I apologize for the small glitches in the screen here, but hopefully you're able to keep up. We're correcting as we go. All right, so you have all the key pieces that you need to know for this unit, okay? So far we've hit all the major themes. Many of the canonical thinkers from the canon I talked about. There's this very specific canon, or what you call the key literary thinkers within philosophy, right? We've kind of talked about the big names, okay, from the early modern period. So the way I've set up this final unit, that being said, you have the key ideas, you have some of the big thinkers that have been set as the main thinkers from this period, okay? So this final unit is set to do three things. Number one, I'm going to introduce you to lesser known voices from the early modern period, okay? You got the big hitters. You've looked at them from various perspectives now, but now you get a chance to basically see other ideas that are worth noting from this period, other thinkers, and then in general, other ideas to consider, okay? So basically, in addition to lesser known thinkers from the period, you'll also get both early modern and contemporary thought experiments that we haven't covered. I've used different case studies and thought experiments so far throughout all of the units, but this will give you an opportunity to see any last important thought experiments from philosophy in general, the contemporary period through an early modern lens, or from the early modern period itself, looking at like Berkeley's work, okay? And this will, of course, continue to help you build your critical thought, as well as give you a big picture of the full scope of the 17th and 18th century, okay? You got some of the key names, but let's hear about some of the other people that played a part. The second thing that I've set up the final unit to do is basically it will act as an ultimate review of the material. We've covered a lot of ground within a short period of time. I mean, squeezing in all the readings and everything you've done in 5 weeks is quite the task. So I commend you for that, like a pat on the back for sure. Okay. So although I've provided you with reviews as we've moved along, these final reviews will help you reinforce all the information from the very beginning, because the final exam, it covers basically everything, right? So you're going to need to know from start to finish all the ideas we've covered, not just unit by unit, because we haven't been testing at the end of each unit, okay? You'll also get to see through this review how all the ideas are technically, like, they weave together, right? We've talked about how some of them connect, free will and ethics and socio-political, but how does epistemology play a part in socio-political thought, or how does ethics and epistemology relate to one another? All of those kind of questions, okay? Hopefully you'll be able to, when you look at the theory and review it as a whole, be able to see the big picture of everything. And then finally, this last unit is designed to be a little less mentally rigorous, okay? It doesn't mean the information, especially about even the other thinkers from this period, it doesn't mean they're not important, but it's designed to be less mentally rigorous because we've been through so much in comparison to the previous units, right? There's so much material that we've covered and tried to learn in a very short period of time, and philosophical ideas can be daunting and complex. And the readings, I know for a fact, were not easy to digest, right? So, your time in this last week should be learning the last few new ideas and individuals from this period, but mostly putting a lot of your mental energy into preparing for the cumulative final exam, which, like I said, is going to cover everything, okay? And assuring that you truly, truly understand all the key ideas we've learned, and that you can apply them beyond the classroom, right? Use that as I go through that review. I'm going to give you ways in which to think about them or put them into a contemporary context that matters in your daily life, so that you can hopefully remember them. Okay. And it really sticks in your mind for the final exam. All right, so you're ready to go. All right, so as usual, thank you so much for your time. You have everything you need to move into your final unit. We are almost there, okay? So keep pushing. Thank you. Move on to the next lecture, and I'll see you there. Take care.